that good?
This meeting is being recorded.
All right, we're recording.
Okay. Well, Walter, just start us again and just briefly introduce me. And unmute Walter.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Historian Ewing, thank you for being here and partnering with us. A Nashville native, longtime Bordeaux resident, grew up in the area. We partnered with him to give us a kind of like a deeper meaning to our work and to our definitely to our commitment in Bordeaux. I mean, we want to be sure that we made this public knowledge, and we thank you again for the in-person presentation, and we thank you for this digital one. And so, historian, please enlighten us on the history of Bordeaux.
Yes, Walter, thank you for the introduction, and Caitlin, thank you for the invitation. It's great to be with you all virtually talking about Bordeaux again. And thank you for the people that have joined online today and that will watch this in the future. I think it's really interesting that there has not been really a deep dive history in the community of Bordeaux. There have been some histories written on kind of the area in general, Northeast Davidson County, including Jolton and Whites Creek, but nothing that kind of captures the spirit of Bordeaux. And my mother built a house there 50 years ago that she still lives in, that I grew up on West Hamilton Road. And our neighbors were colleagues of hers in the metro school system. They were also doctors from Meharry. They were lawyers. They were educators and entrepreneurs. And Bordeaux was always like the Black Westmead. We couldn't live in Westmead or Green Hills, but we had acre lots and Brady Bunch houses. And we were in a great part of Nashville that was growing and doing well. And a lot of the families and a lot of the children knew each other. So I would like to thank Rebuilding Nashville for putting this together. I think Lowe's Home Improvement too for helping underwrite this. So let's get started with the first slide. So this is Bordeaux. This sign is actually behind me. This is an old bus sign, and I've turned it to Bordeaux. It's such an interesting word. So when you think of the word Bordeaux, you think of France, and you think of great wine, and everyone wants to know, one of, I guess, the top questions is, why do they call it Bordeaux? And the reason goes back to the 19th century. An early landowner of the area across the Cumberland River was a dentist by the name of Dr. M.O. Randall. And he had previously been in the Bordeaux region of France. And this particular part of Davidson County outside of Nashville reminded him of that area. And he also wished to have a winery to make wine. So he established a short-lived Bordeaux winery. I'm not sure if they ever got many vines or produced any wine, but that was his intention. The interesting thing about names and gentrification nowadays, there are some old historic Black neighborhoods that the names have been taken away and put on new marketing names. South of Broadway, they call it Sobro now. That was the original Black Bottom when Black people lived there after the Civil War until about 1910, when they kind of pushed the African-American residents out of that area. They lived from the river, from First to about Fifth Avenue, where the arena is, John Lewis Way, and from Broadway to about Korean veterans. In fact, one of the last remaining and only remaining buildings of the Black community in that part of town is the old St. Paul's AME Church, which is now a special events place called the Tower. But I say that in the sense that when they pushed the Black people out of there, they stopped calling it Black Bottom. But it really didn't have a name until probably 20 years ago, 25, when they started to develop the area, and the Nashville scene kind of called it Sobro, and that's what it is today. The area around the state capitol was called Hell's Half Acre. These weren't very positive names, but nonetheless historic names. And when they pushed the Black people out of that area, it just became Capitol Hill. My church, First Baptist Church, Capitol Hill, kind of adopted that name, but that's what it's known for. And then the other area famous to a large African-American population was called Trimble Bottom. That was the area around Fort Negley and just south of downtown. It is now called Wedgwood Houston or Chestnut Hill. And particularly Wedgwood Houston, that's kind of a developer's name. But it's very interesting, and Bordeaux should be very proud that they have a very marketable name. And although I have this old sign over here, I'm surprised that we don't see the name Bordeaux on t-shirts and hats and coffee mugs, because people that live in Bordeaux or grew up in Bordeaux should be very proud of their community. Let's go to the next slide. And this is one of the first maps of Bordeaux that I was able to find. It's from at the turn of the century, and you can see to the right the Cumberland River and the bridge over the Cumberland River, which connected that part of Davison County. The original pike over the river was, we now know as Clarksville Highway, but back then it was a river, that a street that also took you to Clarksville, and it was part of this land that Dr. Randall owned. And so you could see the land right when you cross the Bordeaux Bridge today is the large swath of land that he owned there. And there was one small residence out here. So this was the kind of, if you came across the river during that time, that's what you saw. Interestingly enough, the bridge over the Cumberland River was built in 1889. That was around the time the city had built an improved bridge over the Cumberland River right near the present site of the courthouse, the Woodland Street Bridge. During the Civil War, the Union Army came into Nashville and occupied the city for 3 years. And the fleeing Confederates tore down the suspension bridge over the Cumberland River because they didn't want the Union troops to follow them. So there was, after the war, they had put up kind of a small temporary bridge that was not very navigable to many people or horses and carriages, but they built a very strong bridge at the time. Around the same time, they built a bridge over Bordeaux, connecting us with Clarksville, which was a very prominent 19th century Tennessee city. The two bridges, the other bridges that we know of today, the Jefferson Street Bridge, now named the Kelly Miller Smith Senior Memorial Bridge, was built in 1909, and so was the Shelby Street Bridge, now known as the John Siegenthaler Pedestrian Bridge. So Bordeaux really had one of the early bridges in the county. So next slide, please. And this is a later map of the same area, and you can see the parcels have been subdivided. There's the Cumberland River on the right. And what that really said was this was an area that people wanted to live in, and that was good fertile land. It was probably good farmland at the time. And you have to think about what was going on in Nashville in 1900. So we were, 35 years after emancipation, still kind of regrouping after the Civil War, 3 years after our very successful World's Fair. So we were starting to get on the market, the map. Nashville started banks and insurance companies, and in 1900, Union Station was built. So this was an area, we think we're the it city now, and we are, but at the turn of the century, there was a lot of things that Nashville was proud about and a lot of development that was going on during this time. Next slide. So this is the original pedestrian, pedestrian, this was before cars, pedestrians and horses and carriages that span the Cumberland River. And you could see a sign, there was a fine for traveling too quickly on the bridge and faster than a walk, it says, for driving faster than a walk, a big fine there. But this was kind of the guardhouse too. Most of the bridges and roads at the time were toll bridges because people had expended a lot of money to build these structures. And so oftentimes, including the old Woodland Street Bridge, you had to pay a toll, but this was a very important link. Later on, we of course would have ferries that took people across the Cumberland River up until very recently. Next slide. And this is a more modern picture. This is from the 70s. I kind of remember this view, and you can see the traffic coming in and out of Bordeaux. This is looking kind of north toward Bordeaux from the Metro Center side of the river. And you could see the old Bordeaux Bridge, which was named the Dr. Martin Luther King Memorial Bridge. And I think the thing that we should always be proud of in Bordeaux is Dr. King finally got an honor to have a street named after him in front of the state capitol 50 years after his assassination in Memphis. But growing up, we had the first thing that I know of, and before, I guess, Martin Luther King High School, the old Pearl High School became Martin Luther King High School, we had the Martin Luther King Memorial Bridge at Bordeaux. But as you can see, even then, Bordeaux was a place where a lot of people were coming and going, not only residents of Bordeaux, but people going out to Ashland City and Jolton and other areas through this. So this was always kind of a bottleneck. Next slide. And this is the historic marker about the bridge, which, like I said, we should all be proud that basically, and the marker says in 76, the General Assembly spent the money to change the bridge. Yes, you can go to the next slide. Next slide. And this is one of the old original ferries that went across the river. You know, Hyde's Ferry was the name of the person that ran the ferry. And so there are a lot of ferries in the area because the Cumberland, which is a powerful asset, was really kind of cut off this area from the rest of the city. So people would use the bridge, and they also would use ferries, especially in the early days when you wanted to get to another section. Next slide. Now, this is one of my childhood memories of, we had the in-person speech at the Bordeaux Library, and the site of the Bordeaux Library is right where the Bordeaux Drive-In was. And this is part of my kind of theme of this talk, that Bordeaux did not have the same amenities as some of the other parts of town. So if you lived in East Nashville, there was the Woodland Street Theater, which was a normal kind of indoor theater. Hillsborough Village had two theaters. They had the Belcourt and they had the Belmont. Belmead had a theater. Most Melrose had a theater, and there were some drive-ins around, and this was one of them. And the drive-in theater was built in the 50s and ended in the early 70s. And this is kind of the cool old sign. The sign was up during my childhood in the 70s. Some people might remember that. And then the drive-in movie Big Screen, that was up much later. I think into the early 80s, they left that the actual screen up even after this sign was gone. Next slide. And this was the grand opening, Clarksville Highway at West Hamilton Road, 1956, I believe. And, you know, there was a big feature film. So this, you know, there were a lot of, we think of Bordeaux today as this kind of middle class, affluent suburb. But Bordeaux back then was kind of had the very similar demographics of Donaldson and some other Woodbine, that it was a mainly all white area. Next slide. Oh, next slide. Now this is for the days of interstate highway systems. And the thing that really kind of killed the roadside motel like this, which you could see to the right, there was a restaurant, which I remember being operational when I was growing up. The thing that killed these little mom and pop roadside motels with the cool signs was in the early 70s, you had the expansion of hotels and motels like Ramada Inns, Holiday Inns, and a lot of other kind of Howard Johnson, and these smaller operators just could not compete. So next slide. I think we see a more modern picture.
Hey, David,
Yeah.
cut out really quick at the beginning of that. Can you just kind of?
Oh, in the beginning of the Bordeaux motel?
Yeah.
Okay, so this motel was a place where travelers can stop on if they're traveling from Nashville to Clarksville or just traveling. And the great thing about motels during that era were they were clean, they were safe, they were convenient, they were on the main stretch. Most of the arteries coming into the city had similar motels like this, like Dickerson Road, Murfreesboro Road, Nolensville Road. They all had these little roadside motels, usually one story, maybe two, had a restaurant. And Bordeaux had two of these kind of right next to each other almost. In Nashville, these went out of fashion when in the early 70s, Holiday Inn, Ramada Inns, Howard Johnson started springing up. Those were larger facilities, larger restaurants, and more modern amenities. In these old motels, they would usually advertise that they had air conditioning and later color TVs. That was your amenity. Next slide. Can you, okay. And so this is what a more modern look at the motel, which has been serving as an apartment. And you think about what Rebuild Together Nashville has done is providing people housing in places where they could stay in their own house. But this is kind of what's happening in Nashville. A lot of these old roadside motels have become affordable housing, but now they're being purchased and kind of spruced up for kind of hipster hangouts. There's an old motel on Dickerson Road called the Key Motel, and they've kind of made the swimming pool hip and food. And, now I think they charge a couple $100 or a room. And in the past, you were lucky to probably get 50. And so, the good news is they're preserving these kind of interesting mid-century buildings. But the bad news, a lot of people that this was their home for a long, long time, will have to find more housing. Next slide. So this is the kind of Bordeaux, like Flat Rock or Donaldson, that, it was just kind of a white working class neighborhood. This is the old highway pharmacy. And this was kind of a 1950s picture. And this is kind of the image of Bordeaux that a lot of people who are older remember. Next slide. And this is a prescription bottle from said highway pharmacy around that era in 1960. It was on Clarksville Highway. And it was interesting that on the pharmacy bottle, they put the word Bordeaux and Nashville on there. So even back then, people, really had pride about this particular area of town. Next slide. And this is a picture from 1962. As I said, the demographics of Bordeaux would change later in the 60s, but back then it was kind of very similar to other parts of Nashville. Next slide. One of the kind of interesting crossroads of Bordeaux happened in 1959. Nashville would later have metropolitan government, but before that happened, when they merged the city and the county government, there were some satellite cities in Nashville. Belmead was a satellite city. Berry Hill was a satellite city. So was Forest Hills and Oak Hill. And what a satellite city meant at the time, they weren't part of the city limits of Nashville, but they were in the county. And if you were a satellite city, you basically had your own form of government. You would have some sort of city manager. And if you wanted to have a police department, you could have it. For example, Berry Hill and Belmead both have police departments. You could have your own fire department. But if you became a satellite city, you gave up certain things. If you were a city in the county would be responsible for fixing your roads, paving them, paying for your schools that were in your area. If you became your own incorporated city, you had more to say about what went on, but you would lose the financial support for the county. So there was a group of individuals that put together a campaign to incorporate Bordeaux in the late 50s. And one of the people owned a gambling establishment, which was on the river. And he was one of the really big advocates for this, but apparently not many other people were. Next slide. And back then, if you don't remember, we had two newspapers, the Tennessean and the Banner. The Tennessean was the morning newspaper, and John Siegenthaler was later the editor and the publisher. And it was the more liberal, progressive newspaper. The Nashville Banner was the afternoon newspaper and the conservative newspaper. It was, and the Banner and the Tennessean were about as different as CNN and Fox News are today. And interestingly enough, during this campaign, the Tennessean was more favorable to, looking at what this referendum was, and then the Banner was totally against it. So Bordeaux wanted certain improvements that they weren't getting. And one of the things of Metro government, when Metro government happened, that they merged the county and the city government, a lot of people in the county did not vote for Metro government because they would have higher taxes, but the promise of services like police and fire and water and sewage and street lights and sidewalks would come much, much later. And so some of these same issues popped up during this campaign of Bordeaux. Next slide. And so here's something from the Banner. And so the Banner was painting doom and gloom if Bordeaux was incorporated, higher taxes, and homes would be, people wouldn't be able to afford homes in the area. And so, and back in the late 50s and early 60s, the taxes in Nashville were hardly high. It's interesting about this article in 1959. If you look on the second column and the second paragraph, there's someone talking about the Haynes Heights subdivision, and it was first called, as we remember, the Gold Coast. The Gold Coast was really started by Dr. Johnson, who moved on Wendover Drive. He was a famous Black doctor, and when he moved over there were all sorts of other doctors like Dr. Hansen that moved over there. And it just had this ripple effect. When certain people moved out there and built these great houses, other people followed them. Next slide. So what happened? In 1959, it lost, and it lost badly. Next slide. So it lost 6-1. So all the people that voted, look at this total, 933 were against incorporation of Bordeaux, and only 163 were for it. So that's basically like almost 90% of the people did not want this. Next slide. And of course, afterwards, the Nashville Banner, who was feverishly against this, praised the citizens of Bordeaux for not creating their own city. But what was interesting about this was kind of the last kind of chapter in the old days of Bordeaux before the African-American population moved there. But things might have been different had they incorporated and kind of had more of a form of city government. But when the African-Americans started to build houses and develop the land, a lot of the white population moved kind of to the Whites Creek and Jolton area. Next slide. And so we talk about Bordeaux, and this is an interesting map because it kind of this shows some areas. So you see Clarksville Pike coming up over the Cumberland River, Buena Vista Pike, another very prominent streak in the Haynes area. So when you talk about an Eaton's Creek, when you talk about Bordeaux, you talk about that. And over the years, there's some very prominent people that have lived in Bordeaux. I see Eaton's Creek, the Garretts lived on the Eaton's Creek area. Francis Guess, famous Nashville businessman who now has a street named for him near Centennial Park. And the weatherman Bill Hall also lived in that area. So we had all sorts of interesting people growing up. What's interesting about this particular slide, which was done in the late 50s, around the time of the referendum, you see the proposed Briley Parkway even being contemplated then. And it's only being proposed. They didn't fund it until much later. The funny thing about Briley Parkway is it's named after Beverly Briley. Beverly Briley was the first mayor of the combined metropolitan government in 1963. This map was from 1959. Before Beverly Briley was the mayor of Nashville, he was the county judge of Davidson County. So Ben West was the mayor of the city of Nashville, and Beverly Briley was the county judge. The county judge basically had power of a mayor of where to spend things, where to build roads, where to build schools. And I always thought it was interesting, and most people don't know this, that Briley Parkway was built when he was the county judge, and Beverly Briley named it after himself. So why not? Next slide. So a common theme, so this was later on. So Briley Parkway,
We'll wait till he gets back and I'll let him know. Oh,
This meeting is being recorded.
are we good?
yep. Sorry, we lost you for a second there.
Okay, I'm back. So Bordeaux, when Briley Parkway finally came through Bordeaux, decades after it was first proposed, the banner was covering this, and it was going to be disruptive for many of the residents of Bordeaux because very large chunks of rock had to be blasted out to make this area through. And someone says, Claude Johnson, after 25 years, I don't think my house is still settling. I still have to straighten my pictures out every day. So think about that. You're in your home, all this blasting, your pictures are shaking around, you have to readjust them. And so a common theme of my address will be, sadly, Bordeaux has had a lot of the things that have happened to them, landfills, blasting, other things that other parts of the county has not had to have. Nashville is 525 square miles. And so if you live in Bordeaux, you feel like you have gotten a disproportionate number of all the pains of this growing city. Next slide. So in the early 70s, the urban service district came to Bordeaux. As I said earlier, when we formed Metro government, not all parts of the city were able to get the same amenities like streets and sidewalks and streetlights. And so there was a general service district, which was the farther reaches of the county, like Jolton and Bordeaux and Hermitage, that did not have the same services that East Nashville did, or Hillsborough Village, or downtown, or West End. And so if you lived in the general service district, you paid lower taxes. But in the early 70s, they expanded Bordeaux to the urban service district with a promise of more services, but taxes increased. Next slide. And so here is Beverly Briley's kind of letter to Bordeaux saying all this good stuff's going to happen because you're going to be in the urban service district. The two city council people there, Troy Jones and Ellis Jakes, were, I think, supportive of this, but they were wary. Next slide. One of the kind of sad stories of Bordeaux and how things were different for this wonderful African-American suburb of Nashville, if you will, was companies did not make the same investments that they did in other cities. If you went around Nashville in the 70s, we had three banks here: Commerce Union Bank, First American Bank, and Third National Bank. And let's take Third, for example. They built branches in Green Hills and Melrose and Nolansville Road, and they all looked the same. And they were all this kind of, branches that had parking lots and nice landscaping. But those growing up in Bordeaux remember in around 1975, First American, there was no banks across the river in Bordeaux. There was earlier Commerce Union Bank kind of across from where the motel was, but at that time there was nothing. And First American was going to put a branch there, but for whatever reason, First American decided they weren't going to build a normal branch that they would build in other parts of the city. They literally put a construction trailer there in 1975. And this was not a temporary branch in the sense that, when a tornado comes through, Regions had a trailer, that there was a Parks location, or something has happened that causes, they're doing a remodel, maybe they'll have a temporary branch. They just put a trailer out there. And the trailer stayed out there for over 5 years before First American Bank, a locally owned and run bank here in Nashville, decided that Black people would support the bank and they would build a normal branch with a drive-in window and all the other amenities. And I always just thought that this was just sad, but a common theme of Bordeaux in the 70s and 80s. Next slide. The other thing that Bordeaux had was the landfill. And the landfill was such a public nuisance. It attracted rodents, it smelled, it was noisy, and Bordeaux residents lived very close to their landfill. And this trash was bought from all parts of Davidson County and dumped here. Most people don't know where the landfill was before Bordeaux's landfill was kind of put into place. It was in Metro Center, right near Bordeaux, right on the Cumberland River. And the reason the Metro Center landfill closed was because Metro Center was being developed into this great office park, and they couldn't be bothered with a landfill. So let's just haul the trash across the river and we will put it in Bordeaux. And so that's what happened for decades and decades. Next slide. And so, there was articles in the paper all the time about, the first sentence of this article, the people of Bordeaux are begging for help, and safety was another issue, that the police department had limited resources. And later in this article, the council member for Bordeaux, Thelma Harper, who later was a very famous, well thought of state senator, says, there's some very serious problems in our neighborhood. We can't leave home and expect to go back and find out and find that we're left. We're outraged at the home burglaries, business burglaries, stick-ups, and we want it to be known as a refuge. We don't want that to be a refuge to live in fear. And so we didn't have a police precinct. We didn't have the same police protection at other parts of the city. Next slide. And here come the trash trucks again. Now, this is the most interesting thing that I think about. I give lots of talks and lots of tours about the lunch counter sit-ins, that these were college students. They literally marched in the street, protested, and got arrested. And we really in Nashville had not seen protests to this extent in the African-American community since the 60s. But the people of Bordeaux were mad, and they got out in their signs and they blocked landfills, and they were basically, and so the first sentence of this article by my friend Tam Gordon, who some of you all know, a handful of area residents held an old-fashioned prayer meeting today at the Bordeaux landfill, blocking 50 trucks from entering to the dump for 30 minutes. So this is the kind of nonviolent protests that people made famous here during the 60s. They had their signs, they were blocking, they were praying, and the city just literally kept on dumping on Bordeaux. Next slide. And so here's another article about this, and talking about the nuisances of the area, that, basically there are all these kind of wildlife and deer and because of the trash. Next slide. And here come the promises. as this article said, Bordeaux residents got at least what they wanted for 15 years. Yes, wanted for 15 years, a promise that Metro would improve the conditions of the county landfill. Bill Boner, the mayor of Nashville at the time, announced that the landfill would be policed more closely and operated more carefully, whatever that means. And Thelma Harper basically responds to that, says, we want the landfill closed. And back then in 1988, they said the landfill would reach capacity in less than 2 years. But the city really had not worked on finding another site. There was a committee of various council people, mainly some of Bordeaux and some of not, to kind of look at the issue. But the promises were always there. We're going to help out Bordeaux. There was a lot of illegal dumping, and a lot of other people would dump, the trash would be blown outside the parameters of the landfill too, oftentimes. Next slide. Now, this is a picture that I really like. You have Edith Langster, who was a council person later in the Metro Council, and also one of our first African-American women police officers in Nashville. And then my friend Adolfo Birch's mother, Janet Birch, who was married to Justice A.A. Birch at the time. And she's got a sign that says, "Death, Dirty, Dump," and the kind of a tombstone of when. So this is when they had announced, basically, they finally, after years and years, and they were celebrating, the landfill would be closed. Next. And here is a picture of them, and Ludi Wallace is in the middle of this picture. You see Thelma Harper, that they're literally trying to keep the trucks from coming in to the landfill at the time. Lois Anderson, who was also an early leader in the area. Next slide. And here's a funeral director, Mr. Hockett, and he's complaining that he has to spend $200 because has rat poison, because living nearby, the amount of rodents that feed on people's trash was just unbearable. So next. And then in 1990, as that other picture, the landfill, the city council wanted to finally decide that whether the landfill would be closed or not. And so Metro had to find another landfill if they were going to do that. But, they were promised, okay, finally, you're not going to have to deal with this. Next slide. And here we go with the promises again. Next slide. But it all was for nothing. The landfill was literally reopened by a judge, Judge Nixon, and back to trash being hauled to Bordeaux and dumped there. So just when Bordeaux thought everything was fine and the city would no longer be dumping all their trash there, a federal judge literally allowed it to continue. Next slide. One of the kind of bright spots of Bordeaux is our religious community, and kind of our largest church in Bordeaux, started in the 80s, was Temple. And, the architecture was unique, the space was unique, the landscaping, everything was just big and welcoming. Next slide. And Reverend Graves was the founder and the voice behind, before we had the mega churches that we know of today, Temple was a real kind of beacon in Bordeaux. And a lot of people quickly belonged to that church, and it grew faster than a lot of older churches that had been around 50 and 100 years. And when you have a strong church, that attracts more residents that want to live near their church, and young families really are the heartbeat of most churches. And so when you have a church with lots of people and lots of families, the whole community benefits, and a lot of growth and a lot of houses were built during that time. As the church grew, Bordeaux grew. Next slide. And of course, Reverend Jumwright keeps that tradition going on today, and Temple is just thriving, as Bordeaux is too. And it's important to have the kind of building blocks. As in the old days of Nashville, there were 5 African-American churches, including my church, First Baptist Church, Capitol Hill, a few blocks from the Capitol in the African-American neighborhood. When urban renewal came around in 1954, we lost 4 of those churches. They were torn down and moved to other parts of the county. Next slide. Another kind of thing that Bordeaux residents didn't want that we're still dealing with is our CBS affiliate decided to put a bunch of satellite dishes on the corner of Clarksville Highway and West Hamilton Road. And that did not go over well. Back in the day, I'm not even sure if a station like Channel 5 or any other station really needs those today, or at least those that big a satellite. It's like, you remember the very first satellite dishes compared to a little smaller dish that you get today. But, you know, once again, they just kind of, let's throw it out to the African-American neighborhood. They've got the landfill, they've got everything else. So we're just going to give them that. Next slide. So this is an interesting time. I'm not sure if a governor of Tennessee who is not campaigning has been to Bordeaux recently, but Governor McWhorter, who most African Americans and residents of Bordeaux probably considered an ally at the time, had a community meeting because they were going to put a rehab center, a drug rehab center, in the old Spencer Youth Center on Hyde's Ferry. And once again, you know, Bordeaux has a landfill and a youth center and all these other things, satellite dishes that other people in other parts of the county didn't have, and they're really putting everything in front of us. This is Reverend Ed Sanders, who was one of the leaders of the African American community, probably giving the governor a piece of his mind about putting this proposed, as a paper described, prison-style camp in Bordeaux. Next slide. And I love this picture. There's Thelma Harper and Ned McWhorter, the governor of Tennessee, still getting an earful from the community. And the headline is "Bordeaux livid over this drug camp." And so once again, our politicians are so important to represent Bordeaux. They are our advocates, not only with the city, but the state. And Thelma Harper back then, by this time, she was a state senator. She was good friends with Ned McWhorter when he was the Speaker of the House. So she got him to come out here and personally listen to her constituents. Next slide. So some of the good things that were built during that time, the Kelly Miller Smith Senior Towers, my church, First Baptist Church, Capitol Hill, did this in honor of our minister, Kelly Miller Smith. Those who don't know who Kelly Miller Smith was, he was a close friend of Dr. Martin Luther King. He was the one that trained John Lewis and hundreds of other students in the nonviolent lunch counter sit-ins, and their training happened at First Baptist Church, Capitol Hill on 8th Avenue in the basement back there. But this high-rise was a welcome addition to Bordeaux for people that were retired that wanted to still stay in Bordeaux. And it was a modern building, and it was a great location, and it was the kind of construction that we wanted, you know, nice buildings, not landfills. Next slide. There are also some of the big African-American fraternities and sororities that have presence in Bordeaux. My fraternity, Alpha Phi Alpha, the Tau Lambda chapter, has their house in Bordeaux, and the Ivy Center of the AKAs are also in Bordeaux. And so 2 big investments that have been very welcomed in this community. Next slide. The Bordeaux Library. I grew up in Bordeaux, as I said, on West Hamilton Road, and this was my library. This was the closest library. It was an old community center of probably about 1,200 square feet. And it was like, just think of a small ranch house, and they just gutted the house and put a bunch of bookshelves in there. If you knew what the old Ben West Library looked like, or the Green Hills Library, or the Donaldson Library, those were library buildings. This was insulting, very similar to First American Bank putting a trailer in our community, that the city of Nashville did not care enough for the Bordeaux residents to put a real main library. They just kind of gutted a house and put up some bookshelves, and it was cramped. Next slide. In fact, the library was so cramped for when they had kids programs there, you could only fit probably 40 kids in the room, and their parents couldn't even be in the same room with the program. So they proposed, so this is proposing the library that I just talked about, and it was sponsored by the Bordeaux Civic Club. They actually helped raise money for this building, but it was woefully small and woefully inadequate immediately, and especially when you compared it to other branches. We, of course, next slide. And when Phil Bredesen was mayor, he raised our property taxes to build the downtown library and some other libraries in the city, including Bordeaux, which did not have an equivalent library of the other parts of the community. And that's how we got the new Bordeaux branch library that I gave this original speech to, next to the Kroger on Clarksville Highway. And it's a beautiful building, spacious rooms. And when we had our first speech, we had, I think, about 85 people in that room. And so we needed that. And new libraries should have community rooms and better spaces and areas for kids and areas, adequate parking too. So the old library had none of that. Next slide. And this is a picture of the new Bordeaux library. Next slide. So this was 2006. Megan Barry was mayor of Nashville, and she had an idea to turn the YMCA into a community center for things like food stamps and WIC and other kind of social services. She had a meeting at the YMCA, and she briefly talked about her proposal. She left to talk to the press and left her staff to take the raft of the hundreds of Bordeaux residents. And this was not Bordeaux's first rodeo, with things like the landfill, things like Spencer Youth and drug courts. And so if the mayor's office didn't think that the people in Bordeaux would stand up for this proposal, they were wrong. Next slide. And, you know, people were just mad that day. And you could see Thelma Harper is sitting to the right over there, and she's probably thinking the whole time, really, I still have to fight for Bordeaux? You're still not respecting us. Next slide. And this is an interesting slide. It's very sad, though. It's like, oh, here's Thelma Harper sitting, and a young African-American girl. You know, we have now multiple generations of people holding up signs saying, stop dumping on Bordeaux. Next slide. And then recently, these are a group of community leaders standing in the shopping center parking lot saying, invest in Bordeaux. As I mentioned earlier, Nashville's the it city. We have a lot of investment that is going all over the county. It has not been equally distributed in Bordeaux, private investment and city investment. And so this was brought to everyone's attention. We had, and there is more investment being made in Bordeaux, but we still need more. Next slide. The Chamber of Commerce was started in Bordeaux, the Bordeaux North Chamber of Commerce by Rachel Bell and a group of other civic-minded people, that they wanted to have a unified voice and a lobbying effort of what the priorities were of Bordeaux, and this was a good thing too. Next slide. There's Judge Rachel Bell, who is a judge, but you know, her heart has always been in Bordeaux, and as you know her, if you know Judge Bell, she's all about Bordeaux. Next slide. Council A. Toombs is also kind of a new visionary and leader of our area, and she has been a strong advocate of Bordeaux and has kind of balanced what the growth of the city and what's going on with gentrification and other things. And she has been a great voice for our community. It's one, you know, being in the council is hard work, but kind of like the other council people in the past that had to kind of defend Bordeaux and speak up and get our fair share, she has definitely cut from the same cloth as Thelma Harper and many other our previous council people in Bordeaux. Next slide. And the mayor of Nashville, John Cooper, started a community budgeting process because we felt that North Nashville and the Bordeaux area were being kind of excluded from our $2 billion with a B budget. So out of the $2 billion budget, which is set by the mayor and the Metro Council, they decided to allocate $2 million of that $2 billion and allow the community to decide where that should go and have priority. So next slide. There were community meetings that the mayor attended and his staff, as Fabian Bedney, former Metro Council person that now works in the mayor's office. And this was a listening session. Next slide. And the community got together on many times and prioritized things that they thought North Nashville and Bordeaux needed. Next slide. And sadly, as you could see by masks being worn and because of COVID, this is recent history. Once again, the issue of landfills and other things going on in the city are still happening. And Brenda Gilmore, who took over for Senator Harper in the state legislature, is here in this picture speaking out, and Councilman Jonathan Hall too. It's something that we still need to fight for. Next slide. So this is Bordeaux. Bordeaux is a still booming, thriving area because of the growth of Nashville and because of the foundation that so many people laid growing up. The people that moved there in the late 60s and early 70s that kind of made Bordeaux what it is today. I have lots of fond memories of growing up in Bordeaux, and I'm still thrilled when I hear great stories of Bordeaux and people wanting to live there and just be proud of Bordeaux. And that's one of the things that we are, as residents of Nashville and people that still live in Bordeaux that are on this call and that grew up in Bordeaux, please kind of be an advocate and talk to your council people about anything you want, because they have always been our voice. And if we don't speak up, we don't get our fair share. Thank you. And I would like to take some questions from people. So you could either put them in the chat, or I'm not sure if you would want people to unmute or how you want to handle that.
Yeah, thank you, Historian Ewing, for another wonderful presentation. Yes, we would like to take questions. If anyone has any questions, I guess we'll start maybe in the chat. I'll keep my eye there. Maybe we'll have questions, or if you. Well, I have some. I'm going to start off, and I'm going to preference mine from. Can everybody hear me? Everybody still in? Everybody still in?
Yeah, I can hear.
Walter.
We got you.
At the library, I had a conversation with your aunt. She informed me that I did not live in Bordeaux, so she quickly took my Bordeaux card from me. And so I was put to shame there, but I wanted to kind of like meet her halfway and find some common ground. I informed her that we shop at the same Kroger's, but then she quickly informed me that she was not happy with that Kroger's. And then early in the presentation, at the physical presentation at the library, you had mentioned a reference Kroger's, but we didn't get into it. My first question is there a history with grocery store chains in the Bordeaux area? And then I guess my other question would be around, I guess, years or the time when do you have dates or city events, social events, maybe a political event, maybe the consolidation of metro government caused white flight? Is there a time or an event again when Bordeaux became predominantly African American?
Right. Let's talk about the kind of white flight out of Bordeaux first. As I mentioned, Dr. Johnson built a house on Wendover Drive, and a lot of Black professionals started to move into the area. White flight and wet redlining was very common during the time. And usually back then, if someone Black moves next door to you, you feel that that's just the beginning. And then other Black people will come, and white people were always thinking that my property values will go down or the schools will be different. And so they will move out to another area of town. And Nashville was still growing in the 60s. After World War II, the GI Bill really boomed the expansion of Nashville. These suburbs like Madison and Donaldson and Goodlettsville were really growing. And those neighborhoods were being well established. The white citizens had more access to the GI Bill and funding than we did, and low interest loans and other housing things. So it almost kind of started to happen in the early 60s, but it just really accelerated once Black families started to move in and larger subdivisions. And so white people moved out to the kind of Whites Creek area, the Jolton area, or some just moved over to West Nashville during that time. And grocery stores, that was always the conversation about what's going on in downtown Nashville right now. It's the chicken and the egg that people love downtown. They want to live downtown, but where's my grocery store? I don't want to live, there's no place to buy groceries. So in Nashville, we've had 3 really kind of smaller famous grocery stores, the biggest being H.G. Hill's, which was a locally owned and operated store. And at their peak, they had 100 grocery stores in the Southeast and probably over 40 or 50 in Nashville alone. They weren't in Bordeaux. In fact, John Lewis, the congressman, as a student at Fisk University, would picket the H.G. Hill store on Charlotte Avenue because at the time they did not hire any African Americans. The other big locally owned store was Compton's. A lot of those in West Nashville, out in Donaldson, that area. No Compton's here, or Crooks, or Piggly Wiggly's. What we did have was Big Star, Winn-Dixie, larger Southern chain grocery stores. We didn't have Kroger at the time. And right near the old Bordeaux Drive-In and the roller skating rink that I grew up going to was a CB store, later Conquest. And so those were the stores that we had. They were smaller stores, but I guess at the time growing up, that was the grocery store I was used to. And, you know, Kroger did not, although Kroger was big time in Nashville in the 60s and 70s. And you think about out on Charlotte Pike, when they would build a new Kroger in Madison, it would be a huge store. They'd have a huge parking lot and all of that. But it took Kroger a long, long time to come to Bordeaux. And that's some of the criticism of larger entities that, you know, most companies have different levels of store depending on where they are, what city and state and neighborhood they are. So if you compare the amenities of the Bordeaux Kroger to the one in Belmead or Green Hills, or even, you know, another part of East Nashville that just recently got remodeled, we don't have the same things. And we don't have the same, you know, it's older, maybe the shelves aren't stocked as much, maybe the selection is as much. And so that's where shoppers and people need to hold these large publicly traded companies accountable, that they should not be having different stores depending on the makeup of the city. They should always be similar in every way. It's kind of like we got the trailer for a bank. You know, a lot of people, including my aunt, would think we got the equivalent of a trailer for a Kroger. Other questions?
David, I had a question, and it's kind of more asking you to speculate, but how do you think Bordeaux would be different today if the vote to incorporate as a satellite city had passed? What would you imagine would be different about the community?
So our satellite cities And I specifically think of like Bellmead and Berry Hill and even Oak Hill and Forest Hills. I remember I gave a speech to the city of Oak Hill a few years ago. The mayor at the time, who's now in the state legislature, Heidi Campbell, asked me to come speak there. But Oak Hill was basically a satellite city because they wanted to restrict zoning. They didn't want any apartments. They wanted all at least 1 acre lots, preferably 2 acre lots. And Oak Hill is very interesting because there is 100% of the property in Oak Hill is residential zoning. And even the churches and the schools that are in Oak Hill, every 10 years, they have to get an exception to being 100% residential. So, but it's not even permanent. It's like they have to beg the city every time. So I think if Bordeaux had become a satellite city, they probably would have, the white population probably would have stayed there a little bit longer, and maybe the zoning would have changed to make it less attractive for real estate developers to sell land to white people, and they would have probably done that. And so in a weird way, yes, it's probably good that it failed because there was no system where they can kind of make it hard for one group of people to come out to an area. There was one other kind of funny thing growing up in Bordeaux, and some of the older residents of Bordeaux might remember this. In the mid 80s, the mid 70s, late 70s, Nashville got cable. And the cable station was in Metro Center, kind of across from where the gas company is. And cable was a brand new thing. And since remember maybe your first cell phone that dropped calls and was all scratchy, and the cable companies didn't want to roll out this new product and basically it not work or not be great. So the pilot neighborhood for cable in Nashville was Bordeaux. And so our house was one of the first houses in Nashville to have cable. We got one of those little boxes, 36 channels with a little dial on it. And we even got a certificate from Mayor Richard Fulton declaring that our house was one of the first houses in the city to have cable. And I thought that was interesting that Bordeaux was kind of the guinea pig for cable. We got something good for the first time ahead of all the other people, but I think the real reason was they just didn't want to roll it out to Green Hills and not be working. And so we were kind of the test market. Any other questions?
I just wanted to say, feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question. Let me know if you have any trouble.
I have a question.
Yes.
I was getting ready to type it, but my question to you, David, is about overlays. I see some neighborhoods have an overlay, but I'm also hearing a downside to an overlay on a neighborhood. So what are your thoughts on a particular some neighborhoods getting a zoning overlay as opposed to, will it preserve the neighborhood and protect it, or will it stagnate it? What are
There are
your
a couple
thoughts?
types. There are a couple types of overlays. Probably the most popular is called a conservation overlay, which really kind of protects the historic character of the building from the outside. And these overlays are passed by the Metro Council. So normally what happens if you're a city council person and somebody says, I don't want a bunch of tall and skinnies in my neighborhood, I want this overlay. So an overlay are basically restrictions on how you can tear down a house and remodel a house from the outside. The inside of the house, you can do whatever you want, but the outside of the house is different. So if you have an overlay and something that's deemed historic is 50 years old. So now Bordeaux and these kind of mid-century ranch houses now are great examples of mid-century architecture, are considered historic. And so the first overlays were in the Edgefield area of East Nashville, these Victorian houses. And then, they grew to Hillsborough Village and Belmont, and other parts of the city have overlays. And there's a board that's appointed by the mayor and approved by the Metro Council that I was on 20 years ago that dealt with these overlays. And so if you wanted to change your house, you had to build a certain way with material, design, and even original kind of look and feel. And if you wanted to change your house, you had to go in front of this board called the Metro Historic Zoning Commission. And if you didn't follow the guidelines of the overlay, they basically say no. And so the benefit is that they don't tear down all these houses and build these kind of tall and skinnies, but the downside of an overlay is you lose some of your rights as a property owner just to do whatever you want. I remember, and we talk about rebuilding together. Nashville, I was on that board for many years, and I remember there was like a little old lady that lived in East Nashville, and somebody had sold her aluminum siding for her house, and they put it on there, and that was against the overlay, and she didn't know. And so we basically, this board had to decide whether she got to keep her aluminum siding or they had to take it off at great expense and kind of put back on what was there. And the rules are pretty strict about the overlay. And so those are the kind of things that organizations, you know, community organizations handle. And if we had Rebuilding Nashville back then, they would probably help this woman out with this bureaucracy and things like that. But I think we made her take it off, which was just silly. But those are the rules of the rules. The other overlays deal with kind of uses of properties, like you can't have joint driveways, shared driveways. You can't have building close to the street and other design kind of things that don't deal with necessarily the look of the house, but just the use of the lot. And there are benefits and negatives about that too. But what's happening in Bordeaux is a lot of the new residents of Bordeaux didn't grow up here, and they may not be people of color or African Americans. And so people from out of town, particularly California, they just look at Google Maps and they want to be near downtown. They want to be near the Frisk Museum and the Ryman and the Titan Stadium. And they drop a little map on Google Maps and they look for a mile radius, a 2-mile radius, and a 3-mile radius. And they don't care where it is. They're like, okay, that's close to downtown. I'll live there. And so that's kind of what's happening today.
Thank you.
Other questions? Caitlin, do you have anything to add and more talking about what you do at Rebuilding Together Nashville?
Sure. I mean, I think a lot of what you're speaking about just then rings very true. For those who aren't familiar with our work, our mission and work is we work with existing homeowners who need home repair assistance. So we come in and work in partnership with homeowners to make sure there are no health and safety hazards present in the home, and we work to remediate those hazards through renovation and repair. So if you live in Bordeaux, you may see our yard signs. We've been actively working throughout the different neighborhoods in Bordeaux the last 2 years. And much of our work has been things like roof repair and replacement, working to make sure HVACs are working and homes can be adequately heated and cooled, and making sure homes are accessible so residents can age in place is a big piece of our work. So we're really grateful for our community partners. Our community advisory committee has been wonderful. We love working with neighborhood leaders like Ruby, who have been instrumental in helping get the word out to residents so they know that our services are available. And we've really enjoyed working with other partners like David, who are helping build and celebrate the sense of community that we know and that we've had a chance to experience in Bordeaux. So.
And one of the things we talked about in our in-person meeting was, you know, Nashville's growing so rapidly, all parts of Nashville, including Bordeaux. And 15 years ago, we had this wonderful group of citizens and architects and developers come together, and they came up with this plan called the Plan of Nashville. Mm-hmm. And it was kind of a blueprint of our growth and what we thought were priorities and what we didn't want and how it should be built. There has not been a master plan of Bordeaux as far as I know. Maybe they did it back when they did the landfills and all that was happening, but the community needs to come together now and put together a visionary statement to have buy-in that represents the community, get together on weekends and have charrettes and gathering and say, okay, what kind of homes do you want built? What kind of restaurants and retail do you need? It just doesn't happen overnight. And if you leave it to the community and the builders and the developers, sometimes you get the things you don't want. So that's where you work with your political leadership and say, this is the kind of zoning we want because we want this kind of housing and we don't want this other kind of housing. And so I'm hopeful that sometime this year that, the citizens of Bordeaux, working with our Council Lady Toombs and maybe Senator Gilmore and others, can bring together a group of people to decide what Bordeaux needs and what the future is, because if not, you're just going to get a bunch of people from all over putting whatever they want and not necessarily listening to the needs of the community and the people who have lived here for a long time.
Right. Can I make a comment after that?
Sure.
You're so point on, David, because I think what I've heard a lot is what we want and how we were dumped on. I think we pretty much got the idea of what has happened to us over the years. Now we do need to come together and create a vision and a plan of what we'd like to see happen. And so we have a lot of sidebar conversations of what we'd like to see happen, but I'm gonna make an effort to try to pull us together to create a vision. We did it for our Bordeaux Hills neighborhood, and that's what prompted me to go to the Metro Archives. I went all over as many places as I could because I wanted to get the history of Bordeaux, just like how you did. But I was focused a lot on Bordeaux Hills, where the Bordeaux Hospital is, where the Knowles home is. And I went back and found information. A couple of the pictures that you have is some that I have that I got from the Metro Archives, from the library. And the book that I was mentioning to you the last time, it was Davidson County, The Land and Its People. And it had a lot of history in there. Pretty much what you have and what I came across with the Bordeaux Hospital, going all the way back to when it was first built and what it was named and how the street names. I just wanted to know how everything came together. So your presentation, along with the information that I read and listening to the articles, having really deep, heartfelt conversations with Senator Harper, who was my mentor, and just learning what this area has been through. So now it's time for us to come together and change the trajectory and create a plan and sit at the table. And to me, make our demands, because we deserve, we've been through enough and we have scars to prove it. And now we have to not forget about our history, but try to build a vision on it, because we know what we need. And starting points like this, given the history, is just a gentle reminder, is a reminder for some that opened deep wounds because they were mad and angry. But I think we got something going right here, even with Council Lady Toombs. And for those that did not attend the meeting, there is a large development planned on West Trinity Lane, a $2.5 billion project that has, it's got multiple things in it. The sit-down restaurants that we've been asking for. But then there's the fear that it's going to gentrify. Well, gentrification is already happening. So for the seniors, we need to just, give attention to them so they can lock down on their properties. But anyway, capturing the history, because development is not coming, it's already here. So we need to make those memorial markers and historical markers like you were saying. And thank you so much for all your years of work and making note of things that are happening now. We just need to pull our pieces together and do a before, a during, and an after, because great things are going to happen to Bordeaux. I do believe. My last point is first shall be last, last shall be first. So we've been dumped on. So now it's our turn to say what we want. And I'm going to do my job to try to make that happen. And I'd love to partner with you and anybody else that want to come to the table and put our minds together, knowing where we've been, and make a strategy, do a strategic plan of what we want to see happen. Because we hold the cards now. That's how I feel. Thank you.
And Ruby, something you mentioned is a great segue of something we wanted to share. But one of our pieces of our work is what are wraparound services that can help outside of home repairs, that can really help homeowners stay in their long-term homes and communities. And one of the big issues we've seen is the increase in property taxes and the additional burden that is placed on homeowners. Particularly District 2 had the highest property tax increase of any district in the city. So April 4th is a really important date. Both the state and the city's property tax relief application deadlines are then. So we are hosting a property tax relief panel with both the Metro and the state's offices this coming Tuesday, March 22nd, 11 a.m., Bordeaux Library. Please help us spread the word. And representatives from both offices will be there to help answer questions, get applications, get people registered who are eligible.
One other question, and it's just unfortunate that I won't be able to attend. I have to work on that day of all days, Caitlin. But anyway, I wanted to know if you would ask the question, or if someone knows, what programs do they have in place, or how can we set up a program to help those that don't qualify for the program and that could very well be maybe $100 or $200 short or overqualified? So you have this gap of seniors that's right in the middle, that had it not been for $200 or $300, they would have qualified. So I have an idea of a way we can help them, but I just need to work out the ins and outs of it. But we do have a group there, but I would like to know if they are already working on a plan to help those seniors that just fall in that gap, that just not quite qualify. Right.
We will certainly advocate for increasing income limits, because we've seen that as well. A third organization who couldn't make the panel, but we're helping refer and register homeowners for, is the Housing Fund has a program with much higher income limits. So if you know of a neighbor or an individual who definitely could use some property tax relief, but maybe is a little bit higher income to not qualify for these programs, have them talk to the Housing Fund, because I think they are likely to qualify.
Yeah, I work very closely with Alicia Haddock on that. And for those that don't know, I would encourage them to visit the website, because some of higher income did qualify, and what they're doing is they will help pay the difference between what your property taxes were and what they're now calculated to be. That difference is what the Housing Fund, that piece of the program is helping there for those that went from $900 to $1,600. So that gap, they're helping there with that. So yeah, that is a good resource as well. So, but I think we're coming together and we're getting it. The home improvements is very, very helpful. That Rebuilding Together Nashville is doing, because we want to help them not be gentrified. That's what I tell some people. Nobody can make you leave your home, but there are things that you can do that can put yourself in a vulnerable position. So if you need help with your property taxes, reach out to get help. because people see people moving out and they just assume they were pushed out. But some could have been financial management or for other reasons. So if you need help, humble yourself and ask. There are people that could help. So I, along with Rebuilding Together Nashville, and there's several others, we want to see development come, which is already here, but we also want to preserve those that are the housing stock that we already have. And we want to help with home improvement so you can't age in place, because the bottom line is those that want to leave, where can you go? So
Yes.
we're also looking at affordable housing for that group, because I do know of some that would love to downsize because the husband has deceased, the children are grown and gone, and they have a large home, and now they want to downsize, but where do they go? And some have upstairs, downstairs, they can't go up and down the steps. So somebody need to at least poll another group of seniors to see what their needs are as of now. So I'm always
Okay.
here to help. Thank you for letting me
So-
comment.
Close us out, Caitlin.
Well, just wanted to thank you, David. Thanks for the wonderful talk. Thank you for everyone for attending. Again, this will be recorded and we'll be sharing it as soon as possible, make it publicly available. But thank you all and have a great night.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Good job, Walter. Good job, Jared.